Hello, everyone. My name is Spiro, and I have with me today Steph, Steph Lee, and Steph and I have worked together in the past, not too long in the past, but she is working somewhere else now. But she's been kind enough to share some of her time with me to do this recording. So thank you, Steph, for joining.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So just before we get started about going on the topic that we're going to talk about, I think just as a brief introduction for myself, because this is my first time as well. My name is Spiro, and I am a senior developer, have been for several years now, and have done a lot of different things during my development life cycle. And now I'm kind of doing more or less architectural high-level stuff, but I do also a lot of code on a day-to-day basis. I'm trying to help out by doing recordings like this, and I have my own personal channel, and I'm trying to help out with the CodeBuddies community as well, and this is probably where you're seeing this, is on CodeBuddies. So yeah, and as part of that, we're doing this recording, and so now I'll let Steph talk a little bit about herself.
Hello, I'm Steph. I studied business and marketing at UBC. I quickly decided I didn't want to do that, and so I went to a boot camp and did a 9-week program for web development. I got my first job out of that, which is where I ended up working with Spiro. Now I'm on to my second job, which I started a few months ago. So I've been doing this for about 2 years now. Still pretty new to it and still learning a lot. So it's been really fun.
Good, cool. So it's great that I managed to get you to do this with me, because the CodeBuddies community in specific seems to be composed of a lot of junior and perhaps intermediate developers, mainly people who are just starting out, like yourself, who have a few years maybe of experience or just learning. So it'll be good for them to hear from someone like yourself, and hopefully they'll learn something.
Yeah.
Okay, so our topic is more or less tech challenges and confessions. So we briefly went over some ideas of things we can discuss about some challenges that you faced. And it so happens that some of those challenges were faced when we were working together, and so I can provide some input, but I'll try and stay out of it as much as I can. So I think really what the topic is supposed to be drilling down on is things where you're at a job where everything isn't so peachy, I suppose. And as you well know, development and programming, you can come across all kinds of problems that you'd never expect. And that's kind of what we're trying to expose here, so that other people who are watching can kind of get a sense of what they might come across in their jobs potentially. So you have a couple of things that you've come across in the past that have been particularly challenging for you. Maybe one or two confessions of things you've done that you're not necessarily proud of, but had to do. So I'll let you go ahead with the first topic and kind of describe the problem and what happened.
Yeah. Okay. So our infrastructure was not great. Like there was no framework, and I think a lot can be done without a framework, but the structure of our code wasn't ideal. It was described once as everything was just a view. Like it was just, there was no real separation between views and all the logic, and it was all just kind of included in different files into one big file. And languages were kind of mixed up. So it wasn't like a great setup to begin with, but that's kind of what we were just given. So that's what we had to work with. And then on top of that, we didn't have like a great database structure either. And as developers, we also didn't have like version control or testing or like test databases to work with. So it was kind of risky to do things just in general. Like coding was always a little bit risky, or like having to interact with the database was always a little bit risky. So that I felt was kind of always just the overarching theme, was just that we were kind of limited by that. And there was a case where we had to, so just for some context, we had a database table of like cities in Canada. And this data was populated from a different feed entirely. And so the data was sometimes not clean because this data was coming from people who were typing in this data. So it wasn't like always consistent or normalized. And so we had this database of cities, and sometimes there were duplicates. Like there would be like St. John's with an apostrophe, St. John's with a period, stuff like that. And so what we had to do was we had to put a flag in this one table of cities, marking the city as good data or bad data. And then of the good data, which city was like a primary city, like a big city, and which city was like a smaller city or a smaller market. And because we didn't have like a test database to like test out like a big query or like a big update, I think the solution that you came up with was to make a tool that imports a CSV and then updates the database accordingly, either in batches or whatever. So that's what we ended up doing. And that took us maybe 2 or 3 days to like build it out, test it out, make sure that the database didn't blow up from being touched. Yeah. And I mean, it didn't take us too long. And I think it was probably the best solution, rather than having someone go into the database and like have to manually update 10,000 or so records. Mm-hmm. I mean, they had to do it either way with the CSV, but this way the database was at least kind of stable and safe. But it did eat up about, as I said, like 3 days. And it was only like a tiny part of a way bigger project that didn't have like a hard deadline, but this part of it wasn't intended to take so long. Mm-hmm. And I think that was just kind of like a really good indicator of like how we were kind of held back by the way that everything was set up. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good example. I think, well, it's a good example because, at least in my experience, at least 50% of the time, some of the biggest challenges I come across are stuff that I look at and I'm like, oh yeah, this should take 5 seconds, or like an hour, because you think about it in your head and flagging cities like in a table, you add a column and you set a Boolean value, or something like that. It doesn't seem hard, right? Mm-hmm. But you don't expect that there's a human element that's feeding this data, and the human element isn't consistent, and so then this thing becomes much bigger than it ever should have been. So yeah, and that's tough, and I think it's particularly tough because I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, because you've been through the boot camp process, and I haven't had any formal education in this. So when you're getting trained to learn how to be a programmer, you're not necessarily being trained to deal with the unexpected. Like how can you really be trained for that, right? So when the unexpected comes, it almost doesn't matter how much training you've had. It's always like a gotcha moment for just about anybody.
Yeah, I think part of the learning process, at least for my experience, was like, don't trust that everything's going to be perfect. Like the happy path is almost always not the path you will go down. Like expect people to find ways to surprise you in terms of like your code. So I think in that sense, like at least from my boot camp, I was kind of like, that was brought to my attention because I would be writing like a simple like form, and one of the mentors was like, oh, what happens if they like press submit twice, or like what happens if they don't provide this piece of data. And so that, at least for me, like that was something that was taught to me early on, was to like expect everything to go wrong and to like prepare for that. But I think like with the structure like we were given, we couldn't have prevented that from happening because the data that was coming in was out of our control and was already in there. So all we could do was from our end, like write a bunch of like edge case statements to say like, if it's St. John's with an apostrophe, that's the right St. John's, and every other St. John's is the wrong St. John's. So yeah, I think
dirty.
Yeah. There's a lot of like, if it's this, do this, like specific like case statements that were not ideal, but had to be done.
Yeah, that felt, you know, I don't know how to describe it really, because it felt dirty to write code like that, but at the same time, you understood the necessity behind it. Like, what else? I mean, I'm sure if you were given enough time, you could solve the problem much more elegantly, but you're also under like, you need to get a project done. There's time constraints, and you know, your boss or your supervisor or whomever needs to see something happen, and sometimes you make a compromise because you're like, well, you know, I'll fix it this way now, then I'll come back and make it better later, which almost never happens.
No. Yeah, I mean, I think that like inevitably that will always happen to some extent. Like you'll always write something that you'll be like, oh, this isn't the greatest way to do it, but okay, for me, I feel like I spend too much time on like little details. So I have a tendency to like spend too much time on something that like really doesn't warrant it. But if something doesn't feel like a clean enough way of doing it, I'll spend that time. And so like what I've learned that I had to do is sometimes I just have to step away from that and like just accept that like, wow, this is kind of dirty. Like this is a tiny speck in like the whole process of like what I have to actually get done. And if I spend this much time on it, like I'm not gonna meet whatever deadline, or like whatever needs to get done isn't gonna get done in time. So
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and again, it's like, well, I mean, I think that touches on something that's more like personally unique, somewhat unique to you. I mean, I'm sure others do the same thing, where they're looking at something and just agonizing over the variety of different things that it could be wrong and how they can make it better. And I think I would say, especially when you're starting out, there's kind of this unsaid pressure where you're trying to prove yourself, and so perhaps you agonize a bit more over stuff like that than someone who's been doing it for a long time and can kind of compartmentalize those issues. So that kind of comes with time and experience. But yeah, I mean, that's a challenge. You know, like that's definitely a challenge. Okay, well, yeah, that's good. So I think there was another point that you wanted to make, and I believe it was more of like a confession of some code you've written that never got used.
Yes. So as I said, we didn't have like a framework or anything, and so it wasn't that easy to get the behavior that we wanted from some other apps, like some like React style or like PWA style apps, because we just didn't have the infrastructure for it, and we didn't have the time to invest in that. So what you and I like planned, or like how we designed this feature, was that we would have something that was built entirely in JavaScript and jQuery, just like spaghetti, which, to be fair, it was already a very large string of jQuery spaghetti, and we kind of cleaned it up and like refactored it a bit, but it was still not great. And we built this thing that would like implement a search, and it would be like really quick and like reacty, but not really React. And then we also built this like object that would store your search terms and your like whatever filters you had set, and that was kind of a way to manage state. In like sort of like how like Redux, what Redux or like MobX would do.
Right.
So we built this like intending for this thing to like to manage the state and then like retrieve that data and like repopulate the form or whatever. But what ended up happening was, or at least how the infrastructure was set up, was that the database would actually hold your search and all your filters and everything that you had set. So this object that was meant to like do that and to manage all of that was never used, and it just sits there, and it's not small.
Yeah.
It's meant to hold everything. So it's just sitting there right now. I don't think it's being used. And I mean, ideally we would have changed the part that stored it into the database, but that affected a lot of other things in the site. So we couldn't just make this like quick switch because like everything was kind of intertwined.
Yeah.
So we kind of just left it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good dual edge example as well, because it's not just like a confession of, oh wow, I left this thing here that runs on people's browsers right now with like doing nothing. It's just code that's dormant, which isn't the worst thing in the world, but still. But it also is a challenge because like, how much time did you spend building that?
I mean, the whole project itself was probably like 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Like, including the refactor and getting it done and testing.
Yeah, and we don't like we didn't have any testing QA tools.
No, it was manual.
Manual
combining
testing.
filters and search terms.
Yep, all manual. So like that's a challenge. Like that happens. You work on stuff sometimes, maybe a lot of the time, who knows? And it never sees the light of day, really. You spend a lot of time and effort on it, and then it's like, for whatever reason, it just doesn't happen. Like that can suck, and it can be demoralizing. It can sometimes be demoralizing for people to see that, because you might be proud of what you did. Mm-hmm. Maybe it was a really good solution. I think the code that you wrote for that was really good. It was like it was a breath of fresh air in the right direction from what we had before.
Yeah, it was definitely like, it felt good at the time.
Yeah.
At least like from what we were changing it to, it definitely felt like a good move.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. So that's c'est la vie. That's how it is.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good. I think we've adequately demonstrated some good challenges that are pretty realistic. That you would see, especially as a developer who's just starting out, and stuff that you might not necessarily expect. Like, I think sometimes people think when they go into programming that there's logic and gates and boundaries and structures and definitions and clarity, and I think it should be more like that, but it rarely is. So talking about stuff like this is good. So I did want to ask, on top of that, now that you're working somewhere new, what's an example of a challenge that you're experiencing now that you're working somewhere where there is more structure and clarity and definition that you probably wouldn't have come across when we were working together?
So right now our stack is Rails and a little bit of React sometimes, but not always. And I had worked with Rails before in the bootcamp, but like never for more than like a week or two for a project because I'm actually doing it now, like for real, like I feel like the stakes are kind of higher. So I'm putting a lot more thought into how things are structured and how things are organized. And that was not really something that was an opportunity before because, as I said, everything was just kind of a view and everything was just thrown together. Whereas when I'm organizing my code now, I spend a good amount of time just thinking about like, how do I name this? And like,
Right.
where's the most appropriate place for this to go? And I also get control over like what the data looks like and how it's structured.
Right.
So that's also like a big consideration because before it was just, if I needed to make a new table or a new column, I was just throw it in a table, a big massive table because we're not doing any joins because the database is too sensitive for that, or there's not going to be any like crazy relational stuff in the database because we can't afford to do that.
Right.
Whereas now I kind of have the option to do whatever I feel is appropriate. And because I actually have like a local database, I can try it out. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work and it's fine. And so I think the challenge now is just like getting used to the Rails convention and like reading more into that and struggling with simple things like naming,
Right.
which is actually pretty hard.
Right.
And then on top of that, like because Rails has so many like gems and so many projects that you can just use, being able to just plug that in has been really, really fun, but also kind of challenging because I'm not used to doing that. And I'm not used to like having to learn the intricacies of like this totally separate gem or library. And it's fun and it's also challenging. And before it was like, if we wanted to try something new, it was kind of more just like an investment and we kind of committed to something once we had decided on it. Whereas now I get to like include the gem, try it out. If it doesn't work, I can uninstall it and then just continue looking at other options. So Rails has made things a lot easier and I'm sure other frameworks will do the same. And I think that just like having that available to you is like, or at least like not having those boundaries where things are kind of sensitive or like new things are considered investments, like not having those restricting you can open up a lot more like newer, funner challenges.
Yeah.
That are like what I expected, at least in my everyday. That's what I kind of wanted and didn't get. And now it's fun.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah. Well, that's, I think that's a good comparison. That's a good way to kind of round out the topic, because you can definitely see a clear difference when you're working in an environment where some I don't know what the right word is. I want to say like thought and care has been put into it, but it's not really that, because thought and care was put into both areas, just in different ways. But in any case, when you have that kind of that level of structure and organization, then yeah, you can get a lot closer to what you would expect to do as a developer, what people expect to jump into. But that comes with its own set of challenges as well. It's different, but it's still a challenge, right? And, of the two devils, which one would you rather have, really? I know which one I would pick.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's good. So I think we've done a pretty good job kind of giving some good examples of challenges, and we confessed to a couple of things we're not necessarily proud of. So that's good. I think we've met the requirements of this recording, so that's great. And I appreciate that you took the time out to do this with me and get some preparation work before in place. So that I really appreciate that, and hopefully people who are watching this will find it useful, and maybe we'll open some eyes and shed some light on what people can expect, maybe in some horrible, horrific ways. It's possible. And so to be clear, I don't want anybody to think that we're saying that all places are like this. Don't get scared by this. You and I, when we were working together, ended up in a particularly weird scenario, and with particularly weird code and architecture. So it's not common.
I will say, though, that I did not know it was weird until you joined the team and told us it was weird.
Yeah.
I thought this was normal.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that. You're like, I remember when sometimes you would, you could just see the wheels turning in your head when I'm like, this isn't the way it really should be. And you're like, what, really? Like,
yeah, you were like, hey, we should probably have version control.
Yeah.
And I was like, I thought so too, but everyone else didn't think so.
Yeah. Like, oh man, I don't even know how you lived. It's like telling your kid that you used to work on a typewriter, and they're like, what?
Yeah.
How did that work? It's like, how did you live without version control? But yeah, it can happen. It can happen to you, kids.
Yep.
Cool. Okay. Well, thanks again for your time. And yeah, no problem. This was fun. And I hope that we'll do it again soon. Maybe we'll do another recording for my channel or something. And yeah, it'd be fun to do another one with you. Thanks everyone for watching. And hopefully we'll see everyone again soon.